Welcome to Talking Politics Q&A. I'm Paul Brand and Anushka is joining me to answer your burning political questions. A reminder that you can send them to talkingpolitics@itv.com or reply to any of our social posts. Now, we normally start on the serious topics, but Anushka, I really love this question and I want to start here. Chris on email asks, I've watched the news for years and always wondered, why is 10 Downing Street's door painted black? And we can't pretend we've done this research ourselves. Someone in the office has done it for us. But we've got some quite interesting history here, haven't we?
Except that I still don't quite understand why black, but I'm about to help with the history. I think the reason it's black is that it was already black. It was actually King George II's residence, handed over in 1735 to Robert Walpole, the first Lord of the Treasury, apparently originally number 5 Downing Street. I wonder why they changed it to 10. Maybe added a few doors further up, and it was already black. And get this right, Herbert Asquith actually in 1908 painted it green, maybe wanted a more natural colour, and then it was painted black again in 1916. And over the years it has changed. I sort of have a memory, I don't know if this is true, I think it probably is, I'm probably old enough, of being able to literally walk along Downing Street and you could actually go right up to the front door. But then there was an IRA attack in 1991. The door was replaced with reinforced steel, and of course now you have to stand back behind the gates at the end of the road. And here's a nice little fact as well. The bricks are painted black in Downing Street too. Cleaned after centuries in smog, but deemed too yellow. So painted black to make it seem that they would, always be clean.
Yeah, and I think the door was green for a bit because that was the fashion at the time, apparently. I think it might have been Herbert Asquith's wife who said, I quite like green. Can we do green for a bit instead? And so they changed it, but only for 8 years.
And they would change it again. They might go red, white, and blue with this lot.
Maybe they should change it depending on which party's in office as well. And then the original oak door, of course, as you say, has been replaced by a steel door because of the IRA threat in the 90s. Apparently, that oak door though is still around. You can go and see it. I think it might be in the war rooms underneath Downing Street, Churchill's war rooms, where you can go and have a look at some of the old relics from the past, including the oak door.
I think the first time I ever stood in front of the door was actually at Granada Studios in Manchester. Don't they have a Downing Street door? I don't know if they've still got it, but when I was a kid, growing up in Manchester, I went along, got my picture taken in front of number 10. Who knew that one day I'd be standing there talking to ITV viewers?
David Hine on Facebook asks, do you expect the economy to be the big issue on voters' minds in the local elections, or would it just be local issues? And on this one, I guess, Anushka, we know that local elections are often a protest vote, or maybe a protest vote sounds a bit flippant and a bit dismissive. They're often a way of voters expressing their view on national issues as well as local issues. I suppose when it comes to the economy, it depends whether we're talking about the international economy and all the tariffs, because a lot of the parties are saying similar things on that, or whether we're talking about the British economy and welfare cuts and tax rises, which I think probably would be an issue. What do you think?
I mean, I think the economy is always like one of the biggest issues, if not the biggest. I remember, and this is not here, but for the US election, when the results were coming in overnight, you were like, it's the economy, stupid. It was inflation by a mile that was the thing that people were upset about. Totally agree with you that it's the economy as you feel it, not necessarily as you think it's happening internationally. Local elections can be different. You'll often find in a particular area there's a localized thing going on. Take some parts of the country where there might be a scandal involving the local council or an increase in council tax or something that's going on that makes people vote in a certain way. But no question, this soon after a new government, that people are probably going to be looking at whether it's a protest vote against the current government and possibly still against the Conservatives, speaking to Lib Dems and those in Reform UK, they absolutely want to make their mark in these elections. Slightly complicated because a number of elections have been cancelled because of a local government reorganisation, but nevertheless, I think it will be a big deal, and I think how people feel is going to be a huge part of that.
Yeah, the economy is kind of an interesting dynamic for Reform UK as well, given that Nigel Farage is very close to Donald Trump, and a lot of the economic turmoil we're seeing around the world at the moment is obviously related to Trump's policies in America. That might get a little bit sticky for them, although the polls don't suggest it's become a problem for Reform UK just yet, do they?
I think in a way it may well, but also it's that sort of macroeconomics versus microeconomics. It's like, if you're in Scunthorpe and the steelworks are about to shut, then suddenly the kind of international tailwinds, although I actually think tariffs are a bit of a red herring in Scunthorpe, but international headwinds suddenly becomes a local issue that you're thinking about. But I guess it's like I say, it's whether you feel it. I think one of the big things that Joe Biden, got wrong really was that he just basically said to voters, "You're feeling, the economy's better, so shouldn't you feel better?" And no, they didn't. I think though that said, the Trump spectre definitely looms large over these local elections, both for the Liberal Democrats who have absolutely taken a policy of trying to oppose Trump and saying, look at how close, not just Farage, but Keir Starmer is to Trump, and and Reform UK, who perhaps want to more ride on his, what do we say? Tailcoat.
Coattails.
I've lost coattails. Coattails.
Don't think he wears a tailcoat.
Probably a bit of both, and say, try and kind of like feed into the same idea, the same dynamics, the same idea that local manufacturing has been really stymied, and what can we do to protect it? And that's why, in fact, we've seen Reform UK take a big interest in Scunthorpe, because absolutely that's part of that same messaging. Mm-hmm. That said, I saw Nigel Farage very recently because he did a lobby lunch where he speaks to lobby journalists, and I was sat chatting to him. And it's very clear that he's trying to walk a line with Donald Trump, because Donald Trump is obviously a lot less popular in the UK than the US. He wants to, on the one hand, take a similar strategy in some ways, but on the other hand, make very clear that, where things would be more controversial in this country, they don't necessarily support it.
Okay, well, look, there's quite a few cynical questions coming to us as well, which perhaps we shouldn't be too surprised by, given the way people view politicians these days. But Sally Ann Capel on Facebook says, this government isn't the Labour Party, it's a shameful replica of the Conservative Party. Discuss. And I guess that possibly, if I should speak for Sally, is coming from a place where people are looking at the economic approach of the Labour government, or the approach to welfare cuts, of course, which you've reported on a lot, Anushka, and they think, well, we voted Labour because they were more of a party that cared about equality and poverty, and actually what we've got is Conservatives light, or not even necessarily that light. They've gone further with welfare cuts than the Conservatives did. Do you think it's fair for people to sort of say, actually, what have we voted for?
I mean, I think you could argue this both ways, because I think the Labour Party won in part by pretending to be more like the Conservative Party, by really, focusing in on its fiscal rules, etc., saying that it wasn't going to raise taxes, or certainly implying it wasn't going to raise taxes, and then raising taxes by £40 billion in a budget, which felt like a very Labour budget to me. £40 billion worth of tax rises ploughed into the NHS. On the other hand, they've obviously done welfare reforms, which absolutely feel, as much as the Conservatives would do, more in a Conservative direction, something that would definitely upset traditional Labour voters. So I kind of think you can see it in both directions to some extent. They would obviously argue that there's plenty that they're doing which is more Labour focused, like the workers' rights package, like the investment in green technology. What I would say is that Keir Starmer's overall journey is one that has arguably cost him trust along the way, because at one point he's, going around the country arguing for Jeremy Corbyn, holding up the 2017 manifesto, saying this should be our foundational document. It's how he wins the Labour leadership. He puts forward, 10 pledges, which are very much on the left. He then starts to lead the Labour Party much more in a centrist position. And now he's come into government and, he's finding money from welfare to pay for defence. So I can see why Sally feels the way she does. The thing is, I can imagine centrists who have voted Conservatives in the past, who now voted Labour, thinking, hang on, Labour's just put up my tax too much as well. And I guess when you speak to people in Downing Street, I think they think that the direct switches from the Conservative Party to the Labour Party are really the key to the election and the key to the next election. The question I have, and I think this is a big question, is how relaxed can they be about losing people to the left? Because, we've seen already in the last election, massive increase in the number of independents, the Green Party doing incredibly well. Does that become a problem for Labour in some of the seats that historically have been very safe?
Yeah, I think when it comes to other policy areas as well, I mean, the economy is a really interesting one. And obviously, I think Sally is right to raise the issue of whether Labour and the Conservatives only have sort of a cigarette paper between them on some of their economic policies. But other areas like home affairs, which I cover a lot, I'd say there are some fairly big differences. Immigration, for example, they scrapped the Rwanda plan. That was a massive, massive totemic policy around immigration. So I think there have been some big moves where you can see a real difference between Labour and the Conservatives, to be fair. Joe Wilson on Facebook asks, how much more challenging is it for small businesses with the new workers' rights than before? You just mentioned workers' rights, Anushka. I mean, this hasn't come in yet, but is it going to be difficult for small businesses particularly to take on board the new workers' rights legislation?
I mean, when I speak to people in business, I don't know if you're the same, there's definitely a lot of worries about how they handle this, whether or not they're going to be able to be free to employ people, as they would put it, employ people, give them a go, and then if it doesn't work out, move them on. Businesses argued to us, well, these rules prevent us from taking a chance on younger workers who might be less experienced. Labour would say it's all about protecting workers' rights. I think one thing that is the thread that runs through most of the decisions the government has made is this idea that they want to be on the side of workers. So it was employer nicks rather than employee nicks that they hit in the budget. It's the workers' rights plan, which is obviously difficult for business. And I don't know if you feel this as well, and this is true for small and big business, but they did so much work before the election trying to win over business, and they were helped along by Boris Johnson. And I feel like maybe to some extent with the workers' rights package, but I actually think with the employer NICs rise, they just swept back so much of the work they'd done with business. And yes, they want to be on the side of the worker, but that has left them with a challenge right now.
Yeah, and there's some really interesting small businesses, I think, that will really struggle because we often think of business as, retail or manufacturing, but business can also be small care homes where they're employing people now and they'll have to pay that extra NICs rise. And the margins in the care sector are absolutely tiny quite often, unless they're really, really big care providers. The margins can be really small. So I think, there are a lot of small businesses feel as though the workers' rights package is a blow to them.
The government would say they've protected the very small businesses in terms of NICs. The problem is there's so many just above the threshold.
Tracy says on Facebook, it's a broad claim, but in the main, politicians say one thing to get your vote and then switch once they've got it. Would you agree? I don't know. The cynicism sometimes a bit depressing, but I can understand why people ask it. And I think in some cases, yeah. I suppose, what would Labour say about taxes, Anushka? I suppose they'd say, they didn't rule out an NI rise on employers.
Yeah, but they did give us the completely different sense of what they do. And I ask them regularly about it, especially recently, because I've been updating my book for the paperback version. And one of the questions I've been trying to answer is, did you need to imply as hard as you did that you weren't going to basically raise tax massively, and then you massively raised it? Now, Robert and Tom and I often argue about this because they think Labour would have got just as big a majority, even if they had gone into the election saying we're going to raise income tax or we're going to raise national insurance. I actually don't agree with that. I think their majority is very shallow. I think they believe that in the ITV debate that our colleague Julie Etchingham, of course, led, I don't know if you remember, but of course you will, but Rishi Sunak was attacking Keir Starmer on tax, and
Yeah,
Keir
the tax
Starmer
bomb,
didn't really have
the £2,000 tax bomb.
It is the thing that hurt most in the election, if you ask Labour advisors. And they will say things to me now, senior figures like, oh, all these people who've lost elections in the past now got advice for us on how to win. And they think they could have lost. And they look to 2010 when David Cameron and George Osborne were very honest about austerity and they didn't get a majority. And 2017 when Theresa May came forward with a difficult social care policy and she didn't get a majority. I say to them, yeah, but if you'd been honest, wouldn't there be a trust factor that would now help you to govern? And I think most people accept that, which is, yes, there would be. But what they say back to me is, but if we hadn't won, then we couldn't be in government changing the country. So I think what they've done, and I think Keir Starmer did it in his leadership election, and I think they did it in the 2024 general election, is they were so obsessed with winning because they thought if we don't win, we can't do anything. And they thought, well, then the Labour Party will then change the country. That they did win. And in this case, they won very large, but you didn't know that that was going to be the case.
Yeah.
And now they have to fix a trust deficit because they won by suggesting things that they've now not stuck to.
Yeah, and I agree with you actually on tax. I think if they got into that election saying, yeah, sure, we're going to raise income tax by 1p, 2p, it would have been a much harder election for them. And when you look at some of those majorities and some of those constituencies, they're absolutely tiny. And so, your analysis, in my view, is absolutely spot on. There's a shallow majority and they couldn't have afforded to be that bold on tax. And I think we sort of remember the election campaign slightly, through slightly different, through a slightly different filter now as well, because at the outset, actually, Rishi Sunak did have a little bit of momentum. He called the election. He knew it was going to happen. He hit them hard on tax right at the start because that debate with Julie was quite early on in the election campaign. He was rolling out policies like national service, do you remember, which was actually doing quite well for them. And it was only around the time of D-Day and then some of the other scandals, the gambling scandal that hit Rishi Sunak, that kind of the whole momentum went out of the Conservative campaign. And Labour were almost able to win that massive majority by just not making a mistake. And I think a tax rise would have been a mistake.
I mean, I sort of agree and disagree in as much as I think the Tories were always going to lose that election. But I think it's easy with hindsight of a massive majority. And Labour didn't feel they knew it at the time. And Morgan McSweeney, who was like the chief strategist, was obsessing all the time about the Australia, I think, 2019 election, when the Labour Party were ahead all the way up to the election and then lost. And so it is easy with hindsight. I think tax would have hurt them.
Yeah.
With hindsight, I don't think it would have stopped them winning.
No,
because
agreed.
the Tories were just so damaged. But that was their reason for doing it at the time. The only thing I would say, and this is to Tracy's point, is we don't want people to constantly think that politicians will say whatever they can say to win in order, to get past the line, because that affects trust. And I think if there is a crisis in politics right now, it is a crisis in public trust.
Absolutely. Right, thanks, Anushka. That's all we've got time for today. Thank you for being with us as well, all of you listening, whether you're watching or listening, in fact. And you can watch on ITVX, YouTube and on Spotify. Remember, you can also ask a question by emailing talkingpolitics@itv.com. And if you haven't already, do subscribe on YouTube or on any podcast platform. Have a great weekend.